The congressional hearing was already simmering when Representative Karoline Leavitt leaned into her mic with a smirk. The topic was the ongoing investigation into institutional racial bias in federal housing policy, dry, technical, and deeply consequential. Representative Jasmine Crockett had just finished a blistering data-driven speech that wove personal testimony into hard numbers, laying bare how generations of black families had been deliberately excluded from home ownership. The chamber was still for a breath, until Karoline decided to puncture the moment. "You know, I love when Representative Crockett gives us these TED Talks," she drawled, chuckling to herself. "All fire, all feelings, but I wonder if anyone checks the footnotes on the drama." The chuckle rippled through a few on the far right flank of the chamber. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed. "I'd rather give a TED Talk than peddle in TikTok logic with a congressional badge," she said calmly, her voice sharp enough to draw silence. But Karoline wasn't done. "It's cute, though. Very pageant queen turned protest poet. Maybe next time add a beat behind it." That was when a man in the back of the gallery, a tall, silver-haired figure in a suit, too clean for the heat, outside, slowly stood up. Jasmine turned, almost imperceptibly, at the sound of his movement. Her mouth didn't move, but her eyes said everything. Daddy. The air changed the moment he rose. There was no outburst, no declaration, just the sheer weight of his presence. Congressman Torres from California paused mid-note-taking. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had been whispering to Lauren Boebert, turned her head. Jasmine's father, Harold Crockett, had never stepped into the political spotlight. He was a retired mechanic who had raised 4 children on a Dallas street. No one ever filmed unless it was after something went wrong. But here he was, standing without needing permission, without asking for applause, without saying a single word. And suddenly the room felt reverent. "Who is that?" Karoline whispered to a staffer near her elbow. The aide mumbled something too soft to hear. Jasmine's lips twitched into the faintest smirk. "You wanted drama," she said into the microphone, her voice composed. "That man built our house with his hands. You mock what I say, but I lived what you dismiss. And now the man who taught me to speak with dignity is standing, because even silence from the right man speaks louder than your cheap shots." Karoline's face darkened, but she scoffed, leaning in again. "Spare me the Lifetime movie. This is Congress, not church." Jasmine turned slowly, not to Karoline, but to the room. "Then maybe it's time we brought a little more church to this Congress, because there's too much mockery and not enough meaning." Chairman Graves tapped his gavel once, sensing the temperature rising. "Let's maintain decorum." But decorum had already shattered. Harold remained standing, arms by his sides, face still. Then Representative Bowman leaned forward and whispered something to Ayanna Pressley. She nodded. Then she stood too. Then Cori Bush. Then a staffer. In seconds, a ripple of standing figures filled the back gallery, not chanting, not clapping, just standing, silently. Jasmine didn't ask them to. She didn't need to. It was a moment of quiet rebellion. Karoline shifted in her chair. "Is this a protest now?" she spat. "Or is this supposed to intimidate me?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She placed her hand flat on the table. "No, Karoline, this isn't about you. It's about the fact that some of us were raised to answer cruelty with clarity, not cowardice. You make jokes because you're scared of truth dressed in emotion. You mock fire because you were raised in comfort. But my father..." She looked back again, briefly. "My father never mocked the fight. He lived it. And he raised me not to bow to people who use jokes to silence pain." Karoline's smirk was gone. Her eyes darted around, unsure where to land. She suddenly looked very young and very alone. Just then, Jasmine's father slowly walked out. No speech, no wave, just a quiet departure. The sound of his shoes on the polished floor echoed louder than any gavel. Karoline watched him go, and for a flicker of a moment, her face showed something unfamiliar. Not shame. She didn't believe in that. But confusion. The kind that comes when you realize you've lost control of a room without ever being directly challenged. Jasmine sat back, her breathing slow, her fingers folding into each other. "We all come from somewhere," she said. "You can mock mine, but you can't erase it. And the people who built me don't need to speak to be heard. They show up. That's what legacy looks like." Chairman Graves tried to return to the docket, calling the next speaker. But the hearing never regained its tone. The questions felt hollow. The voices muted. Because something had happened, something more honest than the policy papers and sound bites. A man had stood, a daughter had spoken, and a bully had finally realized not every fight is won with volume. As the chamber emptied 2 hours later, Karoline lingered at her seat, collecting her things more slowly than usual. Cameras had captured the moment. Social media had already clipped it, titled it, trended it. The stand that silenced mockery. Outside, Jasmine walked with her father in step. He hadn't said a word to her inside, but now he looked down and simply said, "You okay?" Jasmine nodded. "I am now." They walked off together. Meanwhile, in the parking garage, Karoline sat in the back of a black SUV, phone glowing with unread messages. Her comms director texted, "Next time, don't poke the fire. It remembers how to burn." But she didn't reply. She just stared out the window. For the first time in months, Karoline Leavitt had no comeback, because for all her training in media war rooms and campaign punchlines, no one had taught her how to handle the kind of power that doesn't need a microphone to be heard. Karoline's silence didn't last long, not because she found clarity, but because her world demanded noise. That night, she appeared on a late segment of Freedom Rising, a conservative web show hosted by Blake Maddox, where she tried to reclaim her image. "Look, I made a joke, a light joke. If we're at a point where standing silently becomes a national protest, then God help our democracy." Blake nodded furiously, eager to spin. "And her father standing like that? What even was that? A stunt?" Karoline offered a forced laugh. "If that's their version of strength, then I guess I missed the memo on what counts as courage now." But underneath her smirk, something was breaking. The segment aired and was immediately clipped by progressive outlets. One reply trended. He didn't rise to speak. He rose so she didn't have to fight alone. By morning, Karoline's mentions were a minefield. Her staff scrambled to frame the moment as overblown, but even friendly journalists began asking, why punch down at a moment of dignity? Behind closed doors, her aides urged her to apologize. "It's not weakness," one said. "It's strategy." But Karoline couldn't. Not because she believed she was right, but because her whole brand was built on never backing down. Meanwhile, Jasmine wasn't celebrating. She was quiet, measured, even as the video went viral. She met with her father that morning at a small cafe in D.C., a place that didn't know his name, didn't know he'd become a symbol. He sipped his coffee slowly. "You good?" he asked again. Jasmine nodded. She tried to turn my truth into a punchline. Her father looked up. "But you made it scripture." She smiled faintly. "I didn't plan any of it. You just stood still," he interrupted. "And sometimes stillness is the only fight they can't beat." Jasmine knew the political world would expect her to strike again. A media round, a campaign email, a viral clapback. But she refused. Instead, she gave a quiet interview to a local Texas radio station. "This isn't about drama," she said. "It's about dignity, and we don't need to scream for it to matter." The interview didn't trend, but for the people who knew where she came from, it landed like thunder. Elders who remembered redlining, youth who had been told their emotions made them less professional. People who knew what it meant when a father stood, not for applause, but because his daughter was under fire. Karoline's situation worsened when her next appearance in Congress was interrupted, not by protests, but by absence. Several black members of Congress walked out as she began to speak. No chants, no signs, just empty chairs. She tried to brush it off. "Typical," she said at the mic. "When things get tough, they bail." But her words fell flat. This time, even some in her own party didn't laugh. Later, Congressman Fitzpatrick told her privately, "You're losing the room, Karoline. You made it personal, and you mocked a man who stood with grace." That night, alone in her townhouse, Karoline rewatched the video, not of her mockery, but of Harold Crockett rising. The frame caught him clearly. Weathered hands, steady breath, no fear. She paused it, played it again. There was no defiance in his posture, just a quiet boundary drawn with presence. And something about that crushed her. Because she had grown up believing strength was about being louder, sharper, meaner. But Jasmine's strength had come from letting someone else stand beside her. And that was a kind of power Karoline had never learned to hold. She didn't cry, but she finally turned off the screen. The next morning, Karoline walked into her office early, hours before staff would arrive. On her desk sat a small envelope. No stamp, no return name, just one line. Some legacies don't need defending, they just show up. Inside, a photo. It was blurry, clearly taken by a phone, but unmistakable. Jasmine walking next to her father, his hand resting gently on her shoulder.